Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Certified Together series. I'm recording another episode around AWS Security Specialist examination today. Now we are doing syllabus walkthrough as of now, so we are still not covering any topic from the syllabus and we are not really deep diving into what the concepts are and how we can pass that certification. We are still into our really initial phase, and of course it will take some time for us to reach to that level where we will be not only familiar with AWS as a AWS cloud computing service, but also how we can make it more secure, how we can clear this certification, which specifically targets around the security concepts and security solutions which are provided by AWS for the workloads, for the applications which are running on top of AWS. Now again, I want to highlight that this is a vendor specific examination and you don't expect to find any relevance or any information around other cloud computing services, which of course makes sense because this is only provided by AWS and this is for AWS. So if you are running similar kind of workload, if you have the infrastructure which is on AWS, this is really relevant for you and for me as well, because personally I am doing projects, I am working on similar kind of environment, and of course I want to make sure that those environment, those applications, those infrastructure which are running on top of AWS are secure. And not only it will help me in understanding more around those security concepts, but of course it will help me in providing a good overview of AWS as well. Because so far I'm learning AWS from the perspective of an architect or from the perspective of infra or platform engineer. So from now onwards, of course, it will be more towards how we can secure the workloads as well. So it's an interesting examination. Means if you haven't seen previous episodes, we have covered so far domain up to domain 4. So you can check out those episodes and you can see what we are trying to do in this syllabus walkthrough these days. Now, before we dive into our main episode, I want to share news with you. So I have bought a book today and I received from Surprise Amazon. We are learning about AWS Amazon Web Service. So I bought a book from Amazon, and this book is AWS Certified Security Specialty Exam Guide. And of course, this have guidance around the examination. So the only reason why I bought the book as well, because of course, I felt that maybe the content which is online by AWS might not be enough. And of course, there are other videos. Of course, there are other content on Udemy, which I'm referring. And I can share with you all those sort of information in the show notes. But what I'm trying to say is, I bought this book especially because I want to make sure that what I'm going to tell you is correct, is having the right information. And of course, I won't be having a read through of this book as it is because I don't want to take those copyright benefits. And for your own sake, for your own self benefit, I would highly recommend that you also buy this book because this looks amazing, because it's a nice book by Mr. Adam Book and Mr. Stuart Scott. So I can show the book as well. Means it should be like other way around. So anyhow, so this is a book which I'll be reading as part of my preparation, and I highly recommend again that you buy this book on yourself as well, because of course I will be using this book to study myself, but I won't be having a read through around that, and I won't be sharing as it is all the knowledge. So I will be just referring it for different contents and different information, and of course it will be nice to have a guide as well. So that's the book I'm referring. It's not that expensive, and you can refer the show notes, link in the show notes, and you will find all the information. So that's all for this introduction. And after this short break, I'll be coming back with our main episode. Alright, before we move into the rest of the domains, so far we have covered domain 1, which is threat detection and incident response. We have covered domain 2, which is security logging and monitoring, and domain 3, which is infrastructure security. And infrastructure security, what I can see is 20%. So it's like maximum. And again, it makes sense because what you're doing is we are securing the infrastructure, you're securing the application workloads which are running on top of AWS. So for sure, this domain, this particular infrastructure security concept will be having the highest weightage, and it makes sense. So for today's episode, we will be covering domain 4, domain 5, and domain 6. So domain 4 is around identity and access management, which is, I felt that this should be coming as domain 1 because IAM is something, it's kind of like a core concept. We have learned enough in CCSP. I mean, we are not an expert ourselves now, but we have a bit idea about security as well. And I feel IAM should be coming all the way in domain 1. So, but we discussed before as well. Seems like this certification is more from the cloud security operations perspective. So that's why they started with threat detection and incident response as a domain 1. So let me share my screen and let's dive into domain 4, which is IAM. here we go. Domain 4, identity and access management. So task statement 4.1, design, implement and troubleshoot authentication for AWS resources. For this, you need knowledge of methods and services for creating and managing identities. For example, Federation, identity providers, AWS IAM, Identity Center, AWS Single Sign-On, and Amazon Cognito. Now, if you recall, in CCSP or whenever we talk about cloud computing, we hear a lot about Azure AD or Active Directory, Microsoft AD. Now that's the thing here. Means again, I want to say this is from the AWS perspective. So we might not be covering that concept because Azure AD or Microsoft AD is kind of pioneer in this particular segment, that they are one of the most widely used identity provided service. But for sure, I don't think in this task statement or in this we need knowledge of AD or Active Directory. But maybe some concepts might be coming from that side. So if you already have knowledge of Azure AD or Microsoft AD, I think it will come handy because ultimately they all are the services which are having almost the similar concept and similar ways of working. And of course, the use case is absolutely same because they are providing you identity and access management. You should be having knowledge of long-term and temporary credentialing mechanisms, how to troubleshoot authentication issues, for example, by using CloudTrail, IAM Access Advisor, IAM Policy Simulator. For this, we need skills in establishing identity through an authentication system based on requirements, setting up MFA, determining when to use AWS STS to issue temporary credentials. So this looks like 4.1. AWS STS is an amazing service. I use it most widely in my day-to-day work, and it's like something we must be using if we are creating even your home lab, because it provides you a temporary credential which you can then use to elevate your rights, elevate your privileges, and of course, as from the security as a whole, that's what we want. We want to make sure that we don't have root credentials for everyone, and we don't have admin level of rights provided to everyone all of the time. So if you want admin level rights, you can use these temporary STS tokens to have temporary privilege escalation, and once your token expires, you will be back to normal. Task statement 4.2, which is design, implement, and troubleshoot authorization of AWS resources. For this, we need knowledge of different IAM policies, managed policy, inline policy, identity-based policies, resource-based policies, and session control policies, components and impact of a policy, principal, action, resource, and condition, how to troubleshoot authorization issues, for example, by using CloudTrail, Access Advisor, IAM Policy Simulator. Now, policy is also another bit which might be really confusing if you are still starting in AWS, because AWS IAM provides a lot of different kind of policies, and as cloud infra engineer or even a cloud application engineer, cloud platform engineer, not talking about only security, but anyone who is working on cloud, they must know what kind of policies should be created and should be associated to a particular user or a particular service. So that's why you can see these different names: resource-based policy, identity-based policies. Each policy have their own specific role, and each policy have their own specific use case. So it makes sense to have different kind of policies and to have knowledge of those policies as well. Okay, so we need skills in attribute-based access control and role-based access control, evaluating IAM policy types for given requirements and workloads, interpreting an IAM policy effect on environments and workloads, applying the principle of least privileges across an environment, enforcing proper separation of duties, analyzing access or authorization errors to determine cause or effect, investigating unintended permission, authorization, or privileges granted to a resource, service, or identity. Okay, so domain 4 actually covers just two task statements. I think this one was the shortest, but it have quite a good weightage as well. So we cannot ignore it, although the task statements are just two. Okay, let's dive into domain 5, which is data protection. Task statement 5.1, design and implement controls that provide confidentiality and integrity of data in transit. So this one is specifically talking about data in transit. It's not talking about the data which is stored on S3 buckets or EBS volumes or any other file store which we have on AWS. It's specifically talking about the data in transit. So this must be interesting because we should be having knowledge of TLS concepts, VPNs, secure remote access methods, for example, SSH, RDP System Manager, Session Manager, System Manager, Session Manager concept, how TLS certificates work with various network services and resources, for example, CloudFront, load balancers, We need skills in designing secure connectivity between AWS and on-premises network, for example, by using Direct Connect and VPN gateways. Designing mechanisms to require encryption when connecting to resources, for example, RDS, Redshift, CloudFront, Amazon S3, DynamoDB, Load Balancer, Elastic File System, Amazon API Gateway. Requiring TLS for AWS API calls, for example, with Amazon S3. Designing mechanisms to forward traffic over secure connection, for example, by using System Manager and EC2 Instance Connect. Designing cross-region networking by providing virtual VIFs. I think VIFs are virtual interfaces and public VIFs. I have to read about it. I've never heard it. I have worked on VPCs and everything, but VIFs, that's new for me. Last statement 5.2. Design and implement controls that provide confidentiality and integrity for data at rest. Now, this one is specifically talking about data which is stored at rest. Encryption technique selection, for example, client side, server side, symmetric, asymmetric. Integrity checking techniques, for example, hashing algorithm, digital signatures. Resource policies for DynamoDB, S3, AWS KMS, IAM roles and policies. We need skills in resource policies to restrict access to authorized user. For example, S3 bucket policy, DynamoDB policies. Designing mechanisms to provide unauthorized public access. For example, S3 block public access. Prevention of public snapshot and public AMIs. Configuring services to activate encryption of data at rest. For example, Amazon S3, Amazon RDS, DynamoDB, Amazon's SQS, Amazon EBS, and EFS. Design mechanism to protect data integrity by preventing modification by using object lock, KMS key policies, Glacier Vault Lock, AWS Backup Vault Lock. Designing encryption at rest by using AWS Cloud HSM for relational databases. Choosing encryption techniques based on business requirements. Task statement 5.3. Design and implement controls to manage the life cycle of data at rest. For this, we need knowledge of lifecycle policies and data retention standards. Now, one interesting thing, if you recall, in CCSP, we read about that we cannot delete data in the cloud with the normal mechanism which we have on-prem or which we use in legacy. Like you can't have the magnetic eraser, you cannot destroy the disk because ultimately cloud is someone else's data center. You cannot go to AWS data center and ask for your data storage devices or your disk on which your S3 bucket is created. So I think for data retention and even data deletion will be a key concept around the management of life cycle of data at rest. So let's check this out. We need skills in S3 lifecycle mechanism to retain data for required retention periods. Designing automatic lifecycle management of AWS services and resources. Example S3, EBS volume snapshot, RDS volume snapshot, images, Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager. Establishing schedules and retention for AWS backup across AWS services. Task statement 5.4. Design and implement control to protect credentials, secrets, and cryptographic key materials. We need knowledge of secret manager, system manager, parameter store, usage and management of symmetric keys and asymmetric keys, for example, AWS KMS. We need skills in designing management and rotation of secrets for workload using database access credential, API keys, IAM access keys, designing KMS key policies to limit key usage to authorized users, establishing mechanism to import and remove customer provided key material. So that's all for domain 5. Let's quickly rush through in domain 6 as well. I know I'm going really fast this time because I really want to cover all these 3 domains in today's episode itself. It might get little longer, and of course we are releasing this episode after at least a couple of weeks now. So I want to make sure that we don't have any other episode around the syllabus walkthrough, and as soon as we go in the main topics and main task statements and concepts, it's good for us because we want to kickstart now. I'm really excited about all these topics and all these concepts. I really want to learn them, and I don't want to do another episode around the syllabus walkthrough. So let's quickly cover domain 6 as well. And I feel that this must be most boring from the other concept, at least for me personally, because it's talking about management and security governance. So task statement 6.1. Develop a strategy to centrally deploy and manage AWS accounts, knowledge of multi-account strategies, manage services that allow delegated administration, policy-defined guardrails, root account best practices, cross-account roles. We need skills in deploying and configuring AWS organizations, determining when and how to deploy AWS Control Tower. For example, which services must be deactivated for successful deployment. Now, that's one thing which I don't like about the syllabus once again. The sequence. Now, when I created my AWS account, first thing I was doing was I wanted to set up a secure way of AWS setting this AWS organization. This syllabus is talking about that all the way in domain 6. So what I really wanted was that I start from the zero and build my AWS up. Because of this, my lab will be setting up organizations all the way in the end. By the time I have already set up my policies, by the time I have already set up my security hub, inspector service, everything, and then I'll be setting up this organization. So personally for me, this topic of management should be starting first, or at least this organization setting up control tower and everything should be coming as first topic, and then we should be going to IAM, and then subsequently all the other topics should be following. So maybe infrastructure security and setting up infrastructure controls around that, finally talking about data which you are putting on infrastructure, so then your data protection, and last should be threat and incident response. So when you have everything secure, finally you are having incident on your infrastructure, how you can secure that or how you can respond to that. So logging and everything should be coming all the way in the end. I'm not sure why they kept it like in this messy way, but it for sure I don't like the way they have put all these domains, like the order of those domains. Implementing SCPs as a technical solution to enforce a policy. For example, limitation on the use of root account, implementation of controls in AWS Control Tower, centrally managing security services and aggregated findings, securing AWS account root user credentials. Task statement 6.2, implement a secure and consistent deployment strategy for cloud resources, knowledge of deployment best practices with infrastructure as a code. For example, AWS CloudFormation template, hardening and drift detection. Now that's another thing. Means this one is specifically talking about infrastructure as a code using CloudFormation. When I started in AWS, I also had similar point of view that if you're using infrastructure as a code in AWS, use CloudFormation, don't use Terraform. Slowly I realized that CloudFormation not only is slightly tough to manage, specifically the drift detection part, which they are talking about, because the state is, I personally didn't like the way they are managing the state. And of course, if you are using multi-cloud, so in my case, if I'm working on Azure and AWS together, it doesn't make sense to learn CloudFormation for AWS and Biceps for Azure. All I need to learn is Terraform and I can manage both of the clouds. But again, this certification is only talking about IAC using AWS CloudFormation. Best practices for tagging, centralized management and deployment and versioning of AWS services, visibility and control over AWS infrastructure. So we need skills in using CloudFormation, implementing and enforcing multi-account tagging strategies, configuring and deploying portfolios for approved AWS service, organizing AWS resources into different groups of management, deploying file manager to enforce policies, securely sharing resources across AWS accounts. Task statement 6.3, evaluate the compliance of AWS resource. So we should be having knowledge of data classification by using AWS services, how to assess, audit, and evaluate the configuration of AWS resources. We need skills in identifying sensitive data by using MESI, creating AWS config rules for detection of non-compliant AWS services, collecting and organizing evidence by using Security Hub and AWS Audit Manager. Task statement 6.4, identify security gaps through architecture reviews and cost analysis. You should be having knowledge of AWS cost and usage for anomaly identification, strategies to reduce attack services, AWS well architected framework. Finally, we are having this as an official task statement and knowledge. And we need skills in identifying anomalies based on resource utilization and trends, identifying unused resources by using AWS services and tools, for example, Trusted Advisor and Cost Explorer, using the AWS well-architected tool to identify security gaps. Well, that's all. We are finally finishing up our walkthrough. So if I start from the beginning, we started with domain 1, which is threat and incident response. Domain 2, which is around security, logging, and monitoring. Domain 3 is around infrastructure security. Domain 4, which is IAM, which we covered today. Domain 5 was around data protection. and domain 6 is management and security governance. So these are the 6 domains which we have to cover as part of this series now. So from next week onwards, what I'll be doing is I will be covering our first episode with first task statement of threat detection and incident response. So first task statement I can repeat now as well. This one is design and implement an incident response plan. I want to iterate again that I don't like the way they have set up this certification syllabus, because what I'm doing as part of this task statement is something which I should be concerned in the end when my infrastructure is ready, it's secure, data is secure, and finally I have to set up the logging and monitoring and incident response plan. But this certification covers this domain as part of domain 1, threat detection and response first. So that's what we have to do. We have to learn about that. Of course, we might have concepts which would be related to topics which are in other domains, and we will be covering as part of the same topic and same start statement. So this is something I did with CCSP as well. I didn't really go with like flow for what we are doing now is right there and then itself. We covered some of the topic in previous domains as part of that particular episode and that particular concept, so that you have a better idea and better understanding whenever this topic will come again in future episodes and future domains. You have a better understanding of what's really going on. So this brings us to end of the episode. I hope you like what I covered today, and once again I thank you all for listening to me. And if you like my content and if you like my voice, please like and subscribe, and please share it with your friends. So if someone who is working in AWS or cloud computing, they want to learn about AWS security, or they are really eyeing towards this certification as well, they can get help. Because what I'm covering as part of this series is I am preparing for this certification, and I will be going with you. I will be getting certified with you, and we will be getting certified together. So goodbye and good luck.